Welcome to this session of the Governor's Economic Summit. I'm Leslie Hinsey, and I just retired as the Executive Director of the Governor's Committee on Employment of People with Disabilities. I wanted to give our great Governor, Gary Herbert, a huge thank you. This is the first time that we've had a focus on people with disabilities and hiring people with disabilities at the Economic Summit, and this is great, and I appreciate so much his efforts on that. I'd like to present two great speakers today. They're coming to speak to us from Marriott Corporation. Richard Marriott, whom I had the pleasure of meeting last night, is a wonderful man. He's chairman of the board of directors of Host Hotels and Resorts, which is among the largest owners of lodging properties in the world. Marriott also serves as chairman of the First Media Corporation, an independent broadcasting firm privately owned by the Marriott family. Marriott joined Host on a full-time basis in 1965 as a manager of Hot Shops restaurant, having held part-time positions with the company since his mid-teens. He subsequently served as Eastern Coordinator of the Roy Rogers Division, Corporate Vice President for Architecture and Construction Division, and Vice President of Property Development for Marriott Hotels. In 1976, Marriott was promoted to Group Vice President of Restaurant Operations, and in 1978, he was appointed Corporate Group Vice President with continuing responsibilities for the company's restaurant business as well as its theme park division. He was elected as director of the corporation in 1979 and assumed responsibility for its data processing operations in 1983. He subsequently was named an executive vice president in 1984 and vice chairman in 1986. Marriott is chairman of the boards of trustees for both the J. Willard and Alice S. Marriott Foundation and the Marriott Foundation for People with Disabilities. A former president of the National Restaurant Association, Marriott serves on the Federal City Council and the National Advisory Council of Brigham Young University. When Richard is through, he is actually going to introduce his fellow speaker, but I want to give you a little bit of information about him. His name is Mark Donovan. He's vice chairman of the Marriott Foundation for People with Disabilities. Mark Donovan currently is vice chairman of the Marriott Foundation for People with Disabilities, served as an inaugural executive director from 1989 to 2000. He's participated on a number of related boards around the country and is a recognized spokesman for issues and opportunities surrounding the employment of people with disabilities. Mr. Donovan's professional roots are in business, with 10 years in the food and beverage management and a decade in several regional and national human resource leadership roles. Join me in welcoming Mr. Richard Marriott.
Well, thank you, Leslie. Went back a little far in history on mine. I think we could shorten that biography by about 3/4. It's great to be here. I appreciate the invitation to be here. You know, I was happy when I heard I was focusing my remarks on bottom line economics, because I don't know what that is, and I can basically gives me the ability to talk about just about anything. And I think when it all comes right down to it, all economics is bottom line economics. Our job as a corporate officer is to make sure that the economics, whatever they are, affect our bottom line for a positive, in a positive way, not a negative way. And our decisions and dynamics surrounding all these things you read about in corporate America sometimes sound pretty complicated. And I'm going to suggest that the basic principles are very simple. In fact, they're obvious. And a lot of people try and make them sound complicated. And I often think of the story of the Lone Ranger and Tonto camping in the desert. They set up their tent, climb in, go to bed. A few hours later, Lone Ranger elbows Tonto in the side and says, "Tonto, look up. Tell me what you see." Tonto looks up, says, "Me see millions of stars." Well, Lone Ranger says, "What does that tell you, Tonto?" Well, Tonto ponders for a minute. He says, astronomically speaking, there are millions of planets and billions of galaxies. Astrologically, Saturn is part of Leo. Chronologically, it's 3:15 in the morning. Meteorologically, it's going to be a beautiful day tomorrow. Theologically, God is great and we are small and insignificant. What's that tell you, Kimosabe? Well, Lone Ranger's silent for a minute. Then he speaks. "Tonto, you idiot, means somebody's stolen our tent." Well, how many times have you asked somebody a question and get this long explanation on something that ought to be a 1 or 2 word answer? And, for my family, the principles of success are simple, and they go back for generations. They translated into the bottom line, really, when a couple of determined young people with dreams, my mother and father, started working. And the secrets of their success are the same principles that you've all heard so many times before. Persistent hard work, recognizing and decisively seizing opportunities as they come along, having a mentor, having somebody you can get some advice and counsel on when the times get tough, and finding good people and working effectively with them. Dr. Christensen was right on the money today when he talked about the importance of developing good people. Well, all of these principles appear over and again in the fabric of my family's 150-year history. And the best way to illustrate them is to tell a few stories about the family. My dad was born in Marriott, Utah. Now, I would venture to guess that there are more people in this audience who know where Marriott, Utah is than any other audience I've ever spoken to. In fact, most of the people don't even realize where Ogden, Utah is. But Marriott, Utah is 35 miles north of here, a little west of Ogden. And it's not a town. It was a township or a settlement founded by my grandfather, John Marriott, in the 1850s. John was a giant of a man. He was well over 6 feet tall, reportedly 300 pounds of solid muscle. He was supposed to have been the strongest man in the county. He was a successful farmer. Came from Northampton, England, to Nauvoo. When he came to Nauvoo, he worked on the building of the Mormon temple there, but he was also a very successful farmer. And the leaders of the church realized what a successful farmer he was, and when they started migrating out here to Utah in 1847, they asked John to go to Garden Grove, Iowa, start a farm, and raise foodstuffs for the pioneers that were going to come for the next 5 years. And John stayed in Garden Grove for the next 5 years. When he finally got to Utah, he sent him up to Ogden, Utah, and said, "We want you to farm the land west of the city." And that became Marriott, Utah. It's now Marriott Slaterville. It was there he met and married a woman who was as strong in character as he was in body. Elizabeth Stewart had grown up in England, not too far from where John lived. She'd been converted to the Mormon church when she was a teenager. She decided she wanted to go to Zion. She sold virtually everything she owned except the shirt she was wearing, the dress she was wearing, and booked passage on a ship to New Orleans. It was a rough voyage. A huge hurricane hit just as they were coming into New Orleans and demasted the ship, almost sank it. But she made it to port, hopped on another riverboat, and went up to St. Louis, where she arrived penniless and decided she better get a job as a housekeeper to earn her keep and to be able to pay to get on a wagon train. Well, while she was working, a kerosene lamp she was carrying blew up and burned over 80% of her body. She was in the hospital and at home for almost a year. And finally, she had earned enough to pay her way on a wagon train. And she made that 1,000-mile walk from St. Louis to Salt Lake City. She got here to Salt Lake City. You'll be shocked to read in her diary that she thought this was the most desolate-looking place she'd ever been to. But she says, "I am not discouraged, because I know the Lord wants me to be here, and I'm going to make the best of it." So she started knocking on doors, trying to find some kind of employment so she'd be able to eat. And she did find employment, things settled down a little bit, and finally she was able to go up and visit her brother, William, who had a farm in Kaysville. He'd come a year earlier than she'd had. When she got to his place, she asked her brother, he says, "Hey, why are you hanging out here in the pigsty?" He said, "This ain't no pigsty, this is my house." It was a little bit primitive. But while she was there, she saw this very large man on a very large horse galloping towards their house. She said his wind was blowing in the breeze. He was a rough, scary-looking guy. The thing that scared her most was that she got a very strong feeling that this guy was going to be her husband. And he said hello, introduced himself as John Marriott, and rode off. 2 days later, he came back and asked her to be his wife. Decisive gene in the Marriott family. Well, Elizabeth agreed. They were married, and they moved into a wagon bed. Great place to start. John had converted this wagon bed into a combination tent and cabin. They stayed there for a few months before upgrading to a sod hut. And finally, after a few more months, they actually moved into a real house. But Elizabeth bore John 10 children, and she raised 6 more children that had been born to his previous wife who had passed away. And one of John and Elizabeth's children was Hiram Willard Marriott, and that was my father's father. So Dad was born a strong pioneer stock. He learned at an early age how to work, and he learned how to survive in a very tough environment. He spent his springs and summers on the ranges of Utah and Nevada, herding his father's sheep, and the rest of the year working on his dad's farm. At 14 years old, he was sent to Omaha, Nebraska with 1,000 head of sheep. They wouldn't let him on the train because he wasn't old enough, so he had to go on a passenger train a day later. When he got there, all the sheep were gathered together with everybody else's sheep in this big corral. The guy who was running the cattle pen saw my dad come up. He says, "Sonny, which of those sheep are yours?" Well, they are all unmarked, you know. Well, he got home with a big wad of cash. His father said, "Gee, you did pretty well on those sheep. How did you do that?" Well, he said, "You know, they were all mixed up. I couldn't tell which ones were which, so I just picked out the biggest ones." Well, he often would say, "You know, my dad gave me the responsibilities of a man when I was a boy." And not a bad way to train your children how to be successful in life. But when he was 19, he was called by the Mormon Church to go on a mission to the Northeast United States. And when he returned, he had a couple of goals. Goal setting works well in business and in private life. His 2 goals were 1, stop herding sheep, and 2, get an education, get a college education. And stop herding sheep was pretty easy. Getting in that college was a little bit difficult because he had no high school credits. He'd never graduated. But he found a mentor, found a friend who could help him, someone who was in the administration of Weber Academy. And my dad got enrolled. 2 years later, he graduated as president of his class and went on to the University of Utah to get his bachelor's degree. Worked 4 jobs during the year to pay for his education, and sold long underwear in the summers up in the Northwest to supplement his income. But his greatest achievement at the University of Utah was meeting a beautiful little black-haired co-ed named Allie Sheets. She was still trying to pay, he was trying to pay his way through school. He was very frugal, and he took Allie on a date to the newest and cheapest restaurant in the Salt Lake. Little orange and black box, sold 1 product, A&W root beer, in a frosty mug for 5 cents. Now, my father was not a real fan of root beer, but he saw people lined up around the block to get this product. And being as decisive as he was, he immediately went down and talked to a guy named Leroy Allen, who was the A of A&W, who had an office in Salt Lake. And he got a license to sell this root beer product in Washington, D.C. and the area surrounding Washington. He passed through Washington on his way back from his mission. Knew how hot and miserable it was in the summer. He figured root beer would be great. He also accomplished something else. He talked Allie Marriott into marrying him when she graduated. And that was really had to go up against her mother a little bit, who was kind of promoting her romance with a young doctor. And she would tell her, she said, Allie, this sheep herder is never going to amount to anything. Marry a doctor. But Allie was impressed with my father's personality, how hard he worked, and how frugal he was. And so she agreed to wait for him. So Dad took off on the train back to Washington, D.C. And on May 20th, 1927, he opened a 9-seat root beer stand. It was the same day Lindbergh flew across the Atlantic. And in later life, he became friends with Lindbergh, and he said, you know, Colonel Lindbergh, you and I started in business on the same day, but you got all the publicity. Well, my father didn't get much publicity, but he did get some business. And as soon as sales were humming along at $100 a day, he took the train back to Salt Lake City, where Allie Marriott was receiving her diploma from the University of Utah, graduating with high honors at 19 years old. They were married, and the next day, they were in his Model T, headed to Washington, D.C. 3-week trip on mostly unpaved roads. Well, business was great. Washington was hot and miserable. $100 a day is a lot of nickel root beer. 2,000 mugs of root beer a day. My mother was the chief financial officer. It means her job was to wash all the sticky nickels at the end of the day, put them in a paper bag, and walk them over to the local bank for deposit about midnight. Washington was a little safer in those days. And but after 4 months, they ran into their first obstacle, weather. My dad hadn't quite counted on the cold winter weather in Washington. When it's rainy and cold and windy, people aren't really motivated to come in for an ice cold mug of root beer. What was the answer? Hot food. And one problem there. When he called Leroy Allen, who had bought the franchise from, and asked for permission to put food in the restaurant, Leroy said, absolutely not. There is no A&W root beer stand in this country with food. And you're supposed to close up and go to Florida or somewhere. My father did not take no for an answer. And after many telegrams, letters from his lawyer was his partner, Hugh Colton, who was a law student at George Washington University, Leroy Allen finally gave up and allowed my folks to be the first A&W franchisees to serve food. And they called their little restaurant the Hot Shop, because now they were serving something hot. And the hot stuff was hot tamales and chili, which my mother was cooking up in their apartment. Be thankful you didn't have the apartment above theirs. But they'd cook them up. My father would take the hot tamales and chili over to the restaurant, and it worked. You know, business prospered. It was an explosive menu. Ever tried eating hot tamales, chili, and root beer in the same meal? In spite of that, they made it. And became one of the largest restaurant chains in the East. They grew their business by taking opportunities to expand into new revenue areas. They were the first restaurant east of the Mississippi to have curb service, where you broke the curb, the cars could drive up and get served, folks could get served right in their car. Nobody else was doing it. Had a fabulous impact on their sales and revenue. They introduced the concept of airline catering. My dad had a hot shop on Hoover Field in Washington, D.C. It was a big grassy field where the Pentagon now stands, and these bold Ford tri-motor planes would pull in there from Eastern Airlines and Capital Airlines. All their people get out, and they'd all run over to the hot shop for food. My dad talked to him. He said, don't they give any food on these airplanes? And I said, no, we sure like some. Well, within hours, he was down talking to Eastern Airlines and Capital Airlines, and got a contract with them to provide box lunches on these airplanes. Started a multi-billion-dollar industry, and it was very good for his sales as well. He was one of the first institutional feeders. When the government was hiring all these folks during World War II, he started feeding some of the federal operations. But the biggest bet And the scariest for him happened in 1957, 30 years after that first restaurant, when he made a bet that really scared him. My father hated debt. He was a very conservative businessman, but he could not resist the opportunity that President Eisenhower was creating with his amazing interstate road system. And my father just happened to have a big lot on the back of one of his restaurants right at Twin Bridges, which is the main entrance from Virginia to Washington. And when he saw all those cars going by, trying to get into Washington and find a place to stay, he took that opportunity and built the 365-room Marriott Motor Hotel. Just wasn't another hotel. This had swimming pools, ice skating rinks, ballrooms, coffee shops, restaurants, bars, barber shop, had everything. And it was a tremendous success. And as they say, the rest is history. Well, the ability of Dad and his team to identify and seize opportunities to expand his food business and the hotel business by generating new sources of revenue has been one of the great keys to Marriott's long-term success. And Clayton Christensen Research, they were creative innovation, I guess you'd say, in Clayton's. My father had never heard of creative innovation, but that's what he was doing. And Marriott continues to grow to this day. Got close to 4,000 hotels now in 80 countries. Marriott operations employ well over 300,000 people. And my company, Host Hotels and Resorts, is the largest lodging, hospitality, real estate investment trust in the world. So these two companies came out of a little 9C root beer stand. Well, success is always sweet, but getting there isn't always easy. And I look back on the early growth of the company, I'm always impressed by the fact that the hot shop restaurant concept grew so rapidly during the worst depression in our country's history. 18 months after that first restaurant opened, Black Friday came. Stock market eventually went down 90%. 25 to 50% of people in many of the major cities were unemployed, lost their jobs. Bread lines formed. It was the worst of times. Several years later, I asked my mom, I said, how in the world did you survive this depression? And she said, well, it's simple formula. Gave great value, hired lots of fabulous people, untrained people, people who were struggling because of the depression. They were looking for a chance to show what they could do. Because we gave them a chance when no one else would, they worked hard and they were intensely loyal. They became the foundation of what is today a company that we all refer to as Marriott International and Host Hotels and Resorts. And that's probably the most important business principle underlying the Marriott story, principle that remains firmly entrenched in the culture of our companies today. Hire great people, hire happy people, hire people with a good attitude. Train them, take good care of them, in turn they'll take care of the customers. And the customers will keep coming back again and again. That is good bottom line economics. Well, for my parents, the success story outstripped their wildest imagination. But it was made possible by a lot of hard work, overcoming a lot of obstacles, and probably a lot of luck as well. Thomas Jefferson's reported to have said, the harder I work, the luckier I get. And I said, we'd like to think anyone in this country could do the same if we just work hard and do everything we can do. But, you know, there are a lot of people on the margins of society because of disability, economic challenge, or lack of prospects. Obstacles can be overwhelming. And many of them, often without employment and independence and self-confidence that a job can bring, really, these are the things that bring those of us in this room happiness and a sense of fulfillment. A lot of these folks with disabilities never get that. And that's my lead to talk to you about our program that's near and dear to my heart. It's a program that really helps create personal success for those with disabilities through employment. 1989, we were inspired by the tremendous contribution these young men and women with disabilities were making to the Marriott Corporation. And, you know, my folks used many of the same principles that we were considering to helping these people to build the company originally. We established the foundation, the Marriott Foundation for People with Disabilities, and its program, Bridges from School to Work. At that time, we were shocked to learn that there were over 250,000 young adults exiting high school special education classes every year. And you know, most of these kids leave high school with dreams of success. Some of the same dreams that my folks had back in the 1920s. And for these people, the possibility of success is not nearly as bright. Statistics suggest that over 50% of these young people graduating from special education classes will be unemployed a year later, and many more will be underemployed. In this day and age, without a job, your life is generally not a happy one. We want to give these youth a chance to dream, a chance to really have a shot at realizing their dreams. My mother in later years told me a story about she and Dad on their honeymoon trip from Salt Lake City to Washington, D.C. in their Model T Ford. They spent their first romantic evening in a room above a bar in Evanston, Wyoming. She said the clinking of the glasses and the clicking of the billiard balls kept them awake most of the night. The next morning they got up, it was pouring down rain. There was no paved road out of Evanston on the way to Cheyenne. So they started out in their Model T, and within 15 minutes, they were in a ditch. They slid off the road. They didn't know what to do. There was no passing traffic. There was no cell phones. There was no gas stations. There was nothing. Well, about 15 minutes later, they heard chains rattling in the distance. Along came a dirty, crusty old cowboy with a team of horses trailing a long chain. He said, looked at my dad, who was 26 years old at the time. He said, well, Sonny, he said, if you'd like me to pull you out for $2? $2 was a lot of money in those days, and Dad didn't have much of it. But, you know, we never know what form a helping hand is going to take. But my father had no doubts that he better use this helping hand. So the cowboy wrapped a chain around the front axle of the Model T and pulled him out of the ditch, and they were on their way. 15 minutes later, they were back in the ditch. 20 minutes later, heard the chains coming. Same cowboy, same price. Got him out of the ditch, and this time they stayed on the road. They really started a journey of a lifetime. Well, the young people we work with in Bridges are in the same situation as my mom and dad were outside of Evanston. They find themselves in a ditch, can't get out on their own. But with just a little help from someone who has the equipment and the knowledge and the experience, they can be on their way. And that's what we're all about, offering a boost to young adults who really need to start and an opportunity to show what they can do. And we don't even charge them $2. So, tell you a little more about Bridges and the lessons that we've learned. I've asked our foundation Vice Chairman Mark Donovan to join me on stage. Mark has been involved in this project since the very first day. He and I worked together on the task force to develop it. He has a fabulous idea of what it's all about and what makes it work and why it's so successful. And I might mention Mark has been in the human resources end of the business for years. He's worked for Marriott for 45 years, although he doesn't look that old. If it weren't for his gray hair, we'd think he was in his 30s. But he has been a tremendous strength to Marriott Corporation and the Bridges program. So, Mark, come on up and tell them what it's all about.
Well, thanks, Dick. And thanks for sharing the longevity with which I've been with Marriott. As some of you may have recognized, that really isn't any kind of message relative to who Mark Donovan is, except that he's getting older. I did start at 18, I want to make that clear, washing pots and pans, so it's been quite a journey. But it's a pleasure to share this stage with Dick. I appreciate the summit giving me that opportunity. You know, it's always nice to ride on Dick Marriott's coattails, and especially in Salt Lake City, so I appreciate the opportunity to be here. And I do want you to know that the Lone Ranger and Tonto story that Dick led off with was really directed at me, who he claims will tell you how to build a watch when asked the time of day. So he continually tries to coach me in this regard, usually with limited success. And I'm going to depart from the script for just a quick second now, because I was struck listening to Clayton this morning, and what a great foundation setting for today, by his premise that what companies need to do in order to succeed is to invest in their good people and make them better people. Because I think an awful lot of the message that I'd like to share and others today will be sharing is that's what a society needs to do relative to the folks with disabilities who may not have the opportunity. Society needs to invest in their good people to make them better people, and they'll prosper as well as companies will. So the downside of my being up here is I don't have any great stories of my pioneering family to tell you, so I don't have that background to share. I'm just a kid from Connecticut. But I do have something equally passionate that I'd like to share with you, and that's how I feel about this Bridges program. That passion springs really not so much from what Bridges does, but from why it works. And I think all of us can learn from those lessons of why it works, and all of those lessons can translate really not only to driving Bridges' success, but to driving the success of your bottom line. But I'll start with just a little tiny bit of the what in order to provide some context. Back in 1989, at the same time we discovered the numbers that Dick shared with you about the work prospects of the thousands of young people who are leaving high school each year in this country, special education. We also did a series of focus groups at that time with employers, and we asked employers about what their key challenges were and how they were addressing them. And not surprisingly, leading the list, I suspect it would lead the list today, of challenges was the challenge of identifying and attracting and retaining a skilled and committed workforce. So we dug into that a little bit, and we asked whether they had included people with disabilities as they looked for candidates for that workforce. And the answers we got suggested about 2/3 of them said that as far as they knew, they had never employed a person with a disability. Now, how many people with disabilities there are in this country varies depending on how you do the counting. But I think regardless of who's doing the counting, it's clear that number is well into the tens of millions. And so to me, that begs a question. Can any business that's interested in building a world-class workforce really afford to turn its back on an applicant pool of that size? So it seemed to us there was an opportunity there back in 1989 to introduce employers who were looking for good employees with young people who were exiting high school with hopes and dreams and ready and willing to work but no opportunity. And to help them, bring them together. That's really what Bridges does. And if I've got to figure out exactly how to use this button, but that seems to have worked. What Bridges does is work with these youth as they exit high school, work with local businesses that have labor force needs, and then bring them together, brokering and supporting mutually beneficial employment relationships. But now on to the important stuff. Why does Bridges work? I'll echo some of Dick's message, and that is, this really isn't very complicated. It boils down to a few principles and elements that inform really everything that we do with Bridges. And while these elements are certainly central to our success, I'd suggest that they're equally applicable to your businesses. So think about these not in terms of a human service program serving kids with disabilities. Think of them in terms of the business that you do and how they might relate there. They, in concert with the principles that Dick's already touched on, can help your bottom line results, I'm sure, just as they helped turn that 9-seat root beer stand into what it is today. So let me talk about two underlying tenets just briefly that really are the cornerstones of all of our efforts. And the first of these is Bridges is an employer-driven program. That means everything we do, first and foremost, has to meet the needs of the businesses that we work with. I talk to business audiences all the time, and my message to businesses audiences is, if Bridges doesn't help you meet your business needs, then you shouldn't participate. There are lots of reasons why you might hire someone with a disability. Because you feel sorry for them, because you feel it's your corporate responsibility, because you feel guilty. But none of those are the right reason. And none of those really help either the individual or certainly your company. The right reason to hire someone with a disability is because they can help you meet your operational objectives. And I'll tell you that if you do hire that right person, they'll do exactly that. Then second tenet follows, I think, naturally from the first, and that is we've got to stop worrying about an individual's disabilities and start focusing on their ability. That's a real paradigm shift if you think of the way society deals with people with disabilities. Think about the label alone, people with disabilities. That's what we call this group of people that sit over here on the side in that definition. So it's a paradigm shift, but I think it's critical to making this whole thing work. I was at a conference of professionals who work with people with disabilities a few years back, and I had someone come up to me and they said, hey, you're a business person, and I'm trying to get people with disabilities employed, so help me out here. Tell me what are some good reasons that I can use with businesses to convince them that they should hire people with disabilities. And my response to that then is the same as it is now, which is there are no good reasons for a company to hire someone with a disability. Successful companies are not in the business of hiring people who can't do. They're in the business of hiring people who can do. So as long as we view some individuals, first and foremost, in terms of what they can't do, they're going to be at a terrible disadvantage, as any of us would be, in the labor market. I mean, put yourself in their position. Can you imagine going to a job interview and the first thing the interviewer considers is a list of all the things you do poorly? I think it'd make for a pretty tough sell. So we have to stop seeing people, stop defining them in terms of their deficits and what they can't do, and start focusing on their talents, of which I assure you there are lots. As a company or as an organization, we know from experience that people with disabilities can be employees with tremendous capabilities. But that transition doesn't just happen automatically. There are several criteria that need to be met in order to assure that result. And by the way, these criteria are exactly the same criteria as it takes to make any employment relation successful. So, spoiler alert here, at the end of the day, successfully hiring a person with a disability really is no different than successfully hiring any individual. First, everybody involved needs to be prepared and committed to making the employment relationship work. That means the individual applicant needs to understand what it takes to be successful on the job. Sometimes for the kids that we're serving, this means things as basic as timeliness and appropriate attire and etiquette and basic interpersonal skills. And the employer, the supervisors, the co-workers have to be comfortable welcoming this individual into the workplace. If there are fears or concerns about disability or anything else, those need to be dealt with before a placement is made, because if it isn't, it'll surely undermine that placement once it is made. And second, and I have no doubt that this is the single most important factor relative to the success of every employment relationship, the job match has to be right. The needs of the employer, the needs of the job, need to match the skills of the individual. As I said earlier, all of this is pretty simple stuff. I always feel a little embarrassed to be up here on a stage saying these things because it's kind of like, well, duh. I would suggest that when it comes to employment, disability is not an absolute condition. It's a matter of context. It's a matter of job match. I'm going to repeat that. When it comes to employment, disability is not an absolute condition. It's a matter of context. I'll give you a personal example. In my youth, my dream job was to play first base for the New York Mets. Yeah, usually there is some giggling around the room. I know I don't look like a first baseman for the New York Mets, although any of you who have followed the Mets in recent years know maybe I do look a little like a first baseman for the New York Mets. But I couldn't imagine anything better. But I faced some real challenges in making that dream a reality. First, I'm a pretty slow guy. You know, growing up, we used to have races, foot races in the neighborhood. I think that happens in a lot of neighborhoods. And of course, from day to day, the participants in these races would vary. But one thing you could count on was I would come in last. Everybody beat me, including, to my ultimate humiliation, all my younger sisters. So I'm a little slow of foot. Additionally, my hand-eye coordination really isn't that great. I'm fine with basic life skills. I can usually go out and eat in a restaurant without embarrassing myself. But those skills don't really rise to the level of athletic accomplishment. And finally, to be totally honest about things, I'm really a little afraid of the baseball. I suspect that comes out of my poor hand-eye coordination. Oftentimes the baseball catches me instead of me catching the baseball. I don't know how many people in this room have ever been hit by a baseball moving at significant speed, but if you have been, you can attest to the fact it hurts. It really sometimes even leaves a mark. So you could suit me up and put me on a Major League Baseball field, or on any baseball field for that matter. But if you did that, I would be severely disabled. But I'd only be severely disabled because I didn't possess the specific skills and abilities to perform as a baseball player. Thankfully, I've been able to work in jobs that haven't required athleticism to succeed, and things have worked out for me, but job match is critical. And finally, all new employees need appropriate support and guidance, especially in their early work experience. What support and guidance is needed will vary by individual, but I think just about everyone, including all of us, needs some kind of assistance and coaching as they start a new job. So this is pretty basic stuff, but each of these criteria, pre-employment preparation, job match, post-employment support, are key to making any employment relationship work, and each are central to the design and the approach of the Bridges program. All in all, that model has really been pretty successful over the years. I'll share just a few statistics with you. We now operate in 9 cities around the country. And as an aside, I'll tell you that we are very excited about the fact that we're working with folks in Utah right now in hopes that Salt Lake City might be our 10th, so stay tuned for news of that. We're serving about 1,000 additional youth every year and have placed over 14,000 of them into competitive employment with 3,400 different companies. But numbers, as impressive as they are, can only tell you so much. So in closing, what I'd like to do is share just a few stories so that you can see these results in terms of real people and real employers. And I'll start with Jeremiah. Jeremiah has significant cognitive disabilities, maybe equally challenging. He grew up and lives in the very tough neighborhood of Compton, California. He's been periodically homeless. When we met him, he was actually selling incense sticks that he made on his own, homemade incense sticks on the street corner, trying to earn a few bucks. Some people would look at him and say he was unemployable. But after a lot of hard work, a lot of preparation. He finally landed really a great job at the big federal courthouse building in Los Angeles. Talk about a change from selling incense sticks. Took a few months for him to learn the position, but he's now been there 3 years. He's helping orient new hires. If you talk to Jeremiah, he'll say he helped show them the ropes. And he's the janitorial staff person that is most requested by the judges in that courthouse when it comes to cleaning their chambers. Christina is autistic, and leaving high school, she knew that she wanted to work towards independence, but she really had no idea of how to start that journey. Again, there were many weeks of preparation, there were many interviews, there were many disappointments in the process of those interviews, but then an opportunity arose at Aronson, which is a top 50 accounting firm, to do some filing. Really, it was just something on a temporary basis for her to get her feet wet and get herself started. Well, she worked so hard at it, and she became so obviously reliable that today, having been there for 7 years, she's a key member of their work team, and she oversees incoming information to client accounts. Her approach to the job, and what employer wouldn't love this, is summed up in just a quick story. 3 years ago, we honored Christina with our Youth Achievement Award that we give annually, and invited her to the big gala in Washington in June to accept the award. Her response was, "Oh, thank you, that's really so nice, but I can't be there, I have to work." Thankfully, we were able to get her the night off, and she was able to enjoy the evening. And then there's Emmanuel, and we have a video for Emmanuel, so I'm going to ask that that be rolled and let Emmanuel tell his own story, hopefully.
I'm Emmanuel Trill, and I live in the Fruitvale District in Oakland, California. Of course, being disabled and how people looked at me, that was a major challenge. And explaining my disability to other people and making them understand what things I can do.
Hi, Emmanuel.
Hi, how are you?
Good. Is that your resume?
Yes, it is.
Thank you. Hey! How'd it go?
It went really well. I think all 3 interviews went really smooth.
Emmanuel's job as a medical translator was a perfect fit with Soma Orthopedics. It was initially a 90-day paid internship. Emmanuel really impressed everyone, so they extended the 90-day paid internship to become something longer. He was originally hired as a medical translator to translate medical documents, but his duties have expanded to translating for doctors who didn't speak Spanish with patients who didn't speak English.
He extended his work, and so a part of his job here was to translate, but he was able and capable of doing a lot more than that.
Okay.
Hola, mucho gusto.
Hola.
When Emmanuel steps into an exam room to interpret for a patient, they're comfortable seeing him, not only because he's bilingual, but because of his personality. It stands out immediately, and our patients are very comfortable around him.
Can you ask her how long this has been going on for?
Que usted tiene dolor en la rodilla y cuánto tiempo ha tenido el dolor en su rodilla.
I've been working with Emmanuel now for 18 months. He's been a tremendous asset to our clinic because he's always energetic, he's always with a smile on his face, and I think that also helps the patients feel more comfortable. And what things make that hurt more?
¿Y qué cosas le lastima su rodilla?
If questions come up, many times the patients feel a lot more comfortable that somebody can translate it right there in front of the doctor, and they don't have to write it down or go home or maybe even get another relative to take time off of work and come in.
Many of the people face barriers like me, just in other ways. Not speaking English, which I understand because my parents don't speak English as well. I think they feel that they have someone that understands what they're going through and what the challenges that they are facing.
I think Emmanuel's developed more confidence in our clinic as he's worked with us, being able to interject things that he thinks may be helpful for the doctor, ask another question of the patient that may get at something that I may not have perceived. But it really means more than just saying you believe in someone. Giving them the opportunity to really shine gives them a chance to take that next step.
What I want to do in the future, I think, is open my own translating business so I could translate for other doctors and help people in my community.
There is an actual industry for that. You know, you can work from home, you're in the cloud, you have the doctor call in, you have the patient call in, and you'll translate for them.
First of all, you have to get an AA degree, then a bachelor's degree, and then go into medical translating school.
He was just really excited about how many opportunities are open to him.
I see life with positiveness, because if you don't see it with positiveness, that may ruin your plans for the future.
One thing that Emmanuel said to me that really kind of wraps up and shows how profound our impact was when he said, "I didn't know there were so many possibilities for me."
So these are the kinds of inspirational results that can be achieved when doors are open to this traditionally underutilized population. This is what can result from taking your good people and turning them into better people. And inspiration aside, each of these stories, and I'd suggest thousands more that they represent, demonstrate the tremendous bottom line opportunity that exists for companies if we simply cast a little bit wider net when it comes to seeking the right person for the job. In each of these cases, the individual is clearly better off, but so is the company, and ultimately so is our society. Bottom line, this works for everyone. So that's what the Marriott Foundation and Bridges are up to. I was prompted to, at this point, say that now that we have a little extra time, Dick and I would love to take any questions or comments. The little extra time we have is about 4 minutes, but if there are any questions or comments that we can entertain, I think there are some microphones around the room that can be made available to you if you want to raise your hand. If not, yeah, there we go.
Yes. Oh, pardon me. I'm from Ogden. Are you aware of the able industry that's been in Ogden for a number of years? It employs these people primarily for assembly type work through the manufacturing facilities in Ogden?
I am not, but there's lots of good organizations all over the country doing lots of great stuff.
Well, then I'll like to see you afterwards, please.
Fair enough. Other questions? Dick, you have any last stories you'd like to tell? Well, it's a pleasure being here. It's a pleasure being a part of this wonderful gathering and this wonderful day of events. I commented to some folks last evening at a little reception that I think it's so critical that this discussion of embracing people with disabilities as valid candidates for the work that we need done in our companies. It's so important that that message be happening at an economic summit and not a disability summit, because as I stressed throughout my remarks, hiring people with disabilities is just hiring people. And what you want is the best person for the job, and many, many times that best person may be someone who has that disability label. So best wishes for the rest of the day. It's been wonderful having a few minutes to share it. Dick, thank you for sharing your time at the podium. Always an honor.